Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, October 24th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Republican Party and Republicans as they increase their endorsements of Kamala Harris to be the next president of the United States of America. Today, former Representative Fred Upton, who represented the southern part of Michigan, endorsing Kamala Harris to be the next president, an endorsement that comes really for Kamala Harris's favor in a state that really is coming down to the wire in terms of how it's voting in the 2024 cycle. 2 months ago, it was competitive. A month ago, it was competitive. 2 weeks ago, it was competitive. 2 days ago, it was competitive. And now as we get through 12 days out before the election, it is just as competitive as it once was, which means every single thing from this point onward absolutely matters. And Fred Upton, among many of the other Republicans who have now come to endorse Kamala Harris, is someone who served as recently as 2022. That was his last election in which he decided not to run for re-election. He represented southwestern Michigan for 18 terms. That's in total, you're talking 36 years in Congress from the state of Michigan as a lifelong Republican, someone who had been representing the GOP for quite some time, who did and was outspoken and critical of the former president, but had never come out in full-fledged endorsements of the opposition party like we are seeing now. And we're also starting to see, too, in the state of Wisconsin, a Green Bay Republican, Wisconsin's longest-serving state senator, endorsing Kamala Harris in a region of the state that matters and referring to the former president as a totalitarian. A number of names that have been used against the former president have really started to be summed up in words like this as to how Democrats are messaging against the former president, but now Republicans are using the same terminology to endorse Kamala Harris. We're seeing it from former U.S. reps, incumbent state senators, and again, this is something that absolutely matters for this election. Another thing, too, the reddest, the biggest city held by a Republican mayor in the state of Wisconsin, also endorsing Kamala Harris to be the next president, a Republican who actually left the party back in 2021 after January 6th, had previously been a big supporter of the GOP and everything that it stood for, eventually realized that he was no longer affiliated with the party, and now endorsing Kamala Harris. And this only adds to the list of Republicans. Major names include former Vice President Dick Cheney, who served for 8 years under the George W. Bush administration, coming out in support of Kamala Harris. Representative Liz Cheney, who served in Congress from the state of Wyoming for an extended period of time, was actually in line to become House Speaker, endorsing Kamala Harris and campaigning with her across numerous battleground states. All around here, Kamala Harris is reeling in endorsements from the Republican Party, and one has to ask, why does this matter in an election? Does it actually matter? And what are some good examples of races in which the Republican Party vote, shifting away from their party nominee, could actually and have actually made a difference in recent cycles? And I would ask you to look no further than the 2022 midterm elections as a good example of how Democrats who can really message on this Republican identity correctly, that bring in groups of Republican voters that otherwise might not have been in their column if the Republican Party nominee just hadn't been so bad in a way. You see that there are many Nikki Haley voters out there that just simply couldn't stomach voting for Trump even when he was the only option on the ballot. That meant either Nikki Haley was getting her name written in or people were voting for her well after she had dropped out of the primary. And there was this pushback and has been this pushback from a very small sector of the Republican Party that now doesn't have a place in the Donald Trump campaign. As Donald Trump says, he doesn't need Nikki Haley supporters in order to win the election. Nikki Haley has not been announced that she's going to be campaigning with the former president. He has yet to bring her out on the campaign trail as many people start to early vote. And here's what we know. We know that the Republican Party is in a position where, at large, they support Donald Trump. We're not going to see 20% of Republicans voting for Kamala Harris in this cycle. It's going to be less than 10%. But the question is, where is this less than 10% maximized, and how is it won over by the Kamala Harris campaign? First and foremost, too, beyond that, you will know that Donald Trump has won this GOP base because he represents what the Republican Party wants to represent in the states. I think what we have really lost in a lot of this discourse on the Republican Party and those who support Kamala Harris is that these Republicans who leave the party say, or endorse Kamala Harris but stay in the party, say, the Republican Party of today is not the Republican Party that I was part of when I served in Congress, served in the state Senate, served as governor, served as vice president, X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day, this is the modern-day Republican Party, and most Republicans are undeniably on board with the former president. The question is, when it comes down to the margins, how is Kamala Harris pulling away some voters here? And maybe this is also equally a pitch to independent voters that are looking for bipartisan solutions, looking for a president that they can turn to and say, not only did Democrats support them, but so did Republicans and independents, and thus be more willing to cross along the aisle and say, I'm voting for Kamala Harris. And it's a big lift, right? Donald Trump has really made no effort to try to reel in any Democrats, any people that are extending beyond RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. That is the extent of what Donald Trump has been able to really bring into what he thinks is a big tent. We have, on the other side of the aisle, looking at it from the perspective, we have on one side Republicans with Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Vivek Ramaswamy, Donald Trump. That is that factor. That is that a faction of the country. On the other side, you have Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, the whole bunch there, but Dick Cheney, Taylor Swift, right? Beyonce, Liz Cheney. It's a very weird, bigger tent on the Democratic side. The question is when it comes down to swing voters, where do they more identify with? I think the big reason why Republican voters endorsing Kamala Harris matters, especially well-known names, is one, because these are names that people have elected and known to trust for a very long time. Fred Upton has been in Congress. He was serving alongside many other members of the GOP in the delegation from Michigan for 36 consecutive years. He knows the voters in Michigan. He is a Republican who campaigned for Republican presidential candidates for year after year after year. But in this cycle, and alone to this cycle, his endorsement of Kamala Harris is a rejection of Trumpism. It isn't that Fred Upton is all of a sudden some liberal who's left-leaning, a leftist, any of those things. He will be likely attacked very much by the right wing for this decision. But it's one that seems to be made out of a preservation point for his party rather than anything that has shifted in terms of his ideology. But it's a decision nonetheless that, again, voters who re-elected Fred Upton for 36 years, who know him and like him, might look at Kamala Harris differently, especially if they're on the fence. Endorsements matter because these are endorsements that come from people that voters know and trust. Think about the longest-serving state senator from the state of Wisconsin as a Republican. This is somebody that people keep re-electing because they trust his opinions, they trust how he legislates, and thus they may be more inclined to trust Kamala Harris as a result. You're seeing it too. Mayors who used to be Republicans now saying, in my red city, you should vote blue. Especially when the margins matter, everything makes a difference. And looking back again at when this strategy worked, I'm sorry that it's taken us so long to get here, but look back at the 2022 governor elections, where in multiple times, Republicans put up the wrong type of candidate, and guess what happened? The Republicans said, let's vote for the Democrat, or in some cases, many independents shifted over because the Republican was so extreme, but many of these Republicans who endorsed the Democrat gave the permission structure and set it up to say, when you're at the ballot box, you can vote Republican down the ballot, but on this race, you should vote against them because they are far too extreme for our state. Look at states like Arizona, where this made a major role, where Katie Hobbs was running against Kari Lake. Think of Kari Lake as Donald Trump 2.0. Now, Kari Lake was leading in the polls and led on Election Day by 4 points statewide. She was riding high from Donald Trump's endorsement. She won the Republican primary despite many other prominent Republicans, including the incumbent Republican governor, endorsing a different candidate. Why? Because she was endorsed by Donald Trump. She embodied Donald Trump. She was Donald Trump in Arizona. But she was more extreme than Donald Trump, and voters didn't like that. And what you found was that, too, she was very critical of the McCain family, very critical of former Republicans, including the incumbent Republican governor, Doug Ducey, who none of which were of service to Kari Lake. And some of the Republicans actually came out and endorsed Katie Hobbs. Well, what happened on election night? The polls were wrong, and Katie Hobbs won the election. And when you look at the exit polling data, you have to take a look at it broken down by party ID. Now, this is Michigan. Let's see if we can get to Arizona. Why don't we just go ahead and jump over? You can see that when it comes down to party ID, the Democratic Party was able to make inroads amongst independents pretty substantially. But look at that Republican number. It isn't just independent voters that were won by 7 points. Democrats only had 4% of those who identify as Democrats vote for Kari Lake. More often than not, these are ancestral Democrats that just haven't switched their party registration and have voted Republican for the past 20 years. On the Republican side, though, you always have some of those, but it's not normally 9%. 9% is substantial. 1 in 10, roughly, registered Republicans in Arizona voted for Katie Hobbs. And you have to ask, why? Because there was this permission structure set up in place that allowed these Republicans to say, just this once, I will vote for the Democrat. Because in 2018, despite Kyrsten Sinema flipping the Senate race from red to blue, the governor's race went to the GOP by 14 points. You have to ask why. The voters in Arizona, at face value, aren't actually that liberal. They only voted for Biden because Trump was against him. They only voted for Hobbs because Lake was against her. That matters in races like this one. But Arizona is not the only example. Another good example is a state like Michigan or Pennsylvania. Michigan, for instance, we can actually just bring it back up here. When you break it down by party ID, I promise you the rest are not going to take this long to get there. But look at this. Only 2% of Democrats voted for Tudor Dixon, but 7% of Republicans voted for Gretchen Whitmer. Independents broke by 13. There are always conservative-leaning independents. There are always right-leaning Democrats. It's about winning those voters over by saying, I'm here as someone who has been endorsed by Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and I can bring and bridge all sides of the aisle to make this happen. And that's not to say Republicans are all of a sudden going to break down 67 to 33. No, it means on the slivers of Republican support that you get does make a massive difference. Gretchen Whitmer went on to win this race with these exit polling numbers by 11 points statewide. Let's continue. Pennsylvania is a great example. The governor's race there was really strong, I will say, for the Democratic Party. But take a look at that Republican number. Democrats got 3% that went to Doug Mastriano, but amongst Republicans, 16% of Republicans voted for Josh Shapiro. 16%, you're talking roughly 1 in 7, 1 in 8 Republicans that were voting said, I'm voting for the Democrat. The independents broke 64 to 33. In the Senate race, not as much, but here's what really gets me. Look at that party ID number. 1 in 10 Republicans voted for John Fetterman. Why? Because Dr. Oz was seen as too extreme and somebody that voters didn't like in the state. That matters. He was propped up by Donald Trump. In Wisconsin, same thing. 3% of Democrats voting red, 7% of Republicans voting blue. And this race is only a few point race. You know, Kamala Harris could even win less Republican support and still win the election with the numbers like this. Look at the state of Arizona. We already talked about this one, not Arizona. Look at the state of Nevada, where there was an important Senate race going on, where Democrats ended up losing the governorship. Large reason you can see that when you take over and take a look at party ID, take a look at that Republican number, when you're looking at the difference here, it doesn't seem too different. But what sways the voters are these independents. The Republicans here can shift back and forth, but independents make all the difference. And a lot of the times, they are persuaded by decisions like this. They're not necessarily hardcore Republicans or identified Republicans, but they are being shifted. And in some cases, Republicans are the ones being shifted. And a good example is Georgia, where the party ID maybe didn't split as much for the Republican Party, but independent voters absolutely did. And so as we get through, and again, this is not even a similar case to what we're seeing in 2024, necessarily. It's a great example of how lackluster Republicans can lose races that they should have been able to win, especially given the national environment, especially given our current national environment. But when you take a look at endorsements like this one in really, really more minute areas, but in high impact states, it genuinely can change the trajectory of an election. And I think that's where we are in this cycle. I think a big reason should Kamala Harris win the election is going to be, in fact, that she's campaigning with these Republicans. Think about where we are for a moment. The base actually isn't going to shy away. And the fact that Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris are campaigning together is not going to be the reason, should she lose, that she loses. But it can be a reason that she can win. We forget that there are voters out there that, aren't as partisan, that are looking for true bipartisanship in a candidate. When Donald Trump says one thing and Kamala Harris does something that is, completely juxtaposed, voters look at that and seriously use that as a point of consideration. That's why Joe Biden was able to defeat Donald Trump in the first place. Biden's entire campaign was elevating, independents and Democrats, but a lot of Republicans too. Governor John Kasich, who came in third in the GOP primary in 2016, spoke at the 2020 Democratic Convention. In 2024, they tried to replicate that with numerous U.S. representatives and people who knew Donald Trump best speaking on behalf of Kamala Harris at the DNC. These are things that happen. These are things that, pave the way for arguments like this to be made to independent voters that I'm Kamala Harris and I approve this message because I'm willing to work with Republicans. Because Democratic voters out there aren't going to say, I'm now going to vote for Donald Trump because Kamala Harris says she wants one Republican in her cabinet. Everything in terms of this terminally online conversation about how, Kamala Harris will lose because of this embracing of a bigger tent just simply isn't true. It's something that led Joe Biden to win in 2020 when more Republicans felt more comfortable not saying, I'm not voting for Trump, because that was the whole thing in 2016 after the Access Hollywood tape came out, but it really didn't mean anything. Rejecting Donald Trump but not endorsing Hillary Clinton doesn't do much. But a full-fledged endorsement of Kamala Harris makes a difference, right? That really does change things. It changes the dynamic. That's what Liz Cheney was really explaining in 2024 in this cycle, was that, it's one thing to say Donald Trump must be stopped. Okay, but the follow-up is how? If you can't answer that question by saying I'm voting for Kamala Harris, it's a dud endorsement. It doesn't really matter, right? You can't really elevate that. The only times it really does make a difference is maybe when you're seeing someone like Mike Pence who just can't endorse his former president, and then people have to ask why, and they can draw that conclusion themselves. But in terms of other representatives who say, I'm just not going to vote for Trump, question is, are you voting third party? Are you voting as a write-in? Are you going to write in Ronald Reagan? Are you going to write in Mickey Mouse? Are you going to write in me? Let's talk elections, right? These are the questions that are being asked. But when you come out and say I'm voting for Kamala Harris, then it changes the story. It changes the headline. It changes the narrative. It changes X, Y, and Z. And so I think in a race as close as this one, Republican endorsements can make a difference. Republican endorsements can boost Kamala Harris's candidacy. This is the map of my most recent prediction. Now, it's going to change tomorrow. We'll talk about it in the video. But this is my most recent prediction that was dated back to the 17th. When a race in all 6 or 7 battleground states, in my prediction, are expected to be decided by less than a point, we really get to a point where every single thing can change the race between now and November. And I think for a while, things look really shaky for the Democratic Party, but we have to wait and see over these next 12 and now soon to be 11 days, what is actually making up the electorate for Kamala Harris? Because what we're finding, too, in the early voting numbers, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, is that Kamala Harris is winning in some of these states 55 to 45 in the early voting polling numbers. And yet, the party affiliation seems to be tied amongst Democrats and Republicans and a good chunk of independents. What that typically means is that some of these independents, a good chunk of them, the majority of them, are voting for Kamala Harris, even though they are registered independents. And that there may be some Republicans who are voting early that are voting for Kamala Harris. Now, I don't think this is going to be some type of massive blowout for Kamala Harris. These Republican endorsements largely are inconsequential when it comes down to the grand scheme of the nationwide Republican vote. But on a statewide level, we could see something similar to that of 2022, where on the national level, Republicans do quite well overall, and the margins narrow from the previous cycle. But on a statewide level, Republicans can lose, despite an overall beneficial national shift. And we might see that this cycle. And the data right now seems to suggest that based on some of these endorsements, based on some of the early voting numbers, that may in fact be the case. But only time will tell if Kamala Harris wins the election, and further, numbers will tell if Kamala Harris wins the election on the backs of Democrats, independents, and in fact, some Republicans. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Sorry, tomorrow.